and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Jasmin, and I'm joined by Laura to revisit our recent episode on methane made by cows and take a closer look at the biology. Laura, what about the episode intrigued you?
So when I was listening to you guys talking after you recorded the episode, you were talking about how the methane is made by organisms in the cow's gut. So bearing this in mind and the things you were talking about, there were two things that interested me. How do you select a cow to produce less methane if you're just breeding them and doing selective breeding? And then how do you feed a cow or its gut bacteria to do the same thing? Because that's the two things you're talking about, altering the food or selective breeding them. So I did a little bit of digging based on the things that you said and found out some really wild stuff.
Okay, cool. So those two things then. Let's take a look at the bacteria first, because from a chemical engineering perspective, because we're both chemical engineers by background, kind of.
Kind of, yeah.
I would say me more so than you. You just have a PhD in Chem-Eng. I have a bachelor's and a PhD in Chem-Eng. So from a Chem-Eng perspective, bacteria is really important for anaerobic digesters. So yeah, let's just start there.
I guess to think of your anaerobic digester in the cow. Turn the cow into a chemical engineering system is where we're going with this.
Yes.
You're talking about cows being ruminants, so they have different compartments of their stomachs, or some people say 4 stomachs. They each do different things.
Yeah.
So the first part of the stomach is where they do the ruminant work, where the cow regurgitates its food, chews it up in its mouth, sends it back down to the ruminant chamber and keeps doing this.
Yeah.
This is where the bacteria break down the food to produce smaller particles and then things like methane as well.
So in the cow's stomach, there is a series of different reactions that occur. You got bacteria that first break down the carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids into simple, actual useful things like glucose, fatty acids, amino acids.
Yeah.
But then you've got 3 more reactions that end up in the methane being produced. So the second reaction is basically you have more bacteria, which then are different, and also different bacteria, which converts the volatile fatty acids and alcohols into other chemicals. These then get broken down further by more bacteria to produce acetic acid, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. And it's the carbon dioxide and hydrogen that are particularly important because then you have something that's called methanogenesis, where you've got methanogenic bacteria that will basically produce the methane using the hydrogen and other chemicals being produced. So that's basically how you get methane in a cow's stomach.
Yeah, so this is what I was reading about. There are all these really complicated interactions going on. Like, it's not just one bacterium doing a thing. They're all sort of sharing resources and kind of sending things back and forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately, you're right. It's about the hydrogen production and how it's used. So there are many metabolic pathways involved in producing or using the hydrogen, is what I was reading.
So obviously methane's not actually a useful product for the cow, unless cows can somehow develop the ability to burn it in their stomachs to make fuel and energy. But obviously from a Chem-Eng perspective, anaerobic digestion, you want to get the methane because then you can use that as a substitute for natural gas. So from a Chem-Eng perspective, anaerobic digestion, you're really interested in the bacteria and how to optimize and enhance the bacteria as well as the conditions of the anaerobic digestion so you can get the methane so you can use it as a fuel.
So I guess in this case, it's similar that you want to optimize what the bacteria or the gut fauna or the microorganisms, different words for similar thing.
Yeah.
You want to optimize what they're doing in the cow, but for a different purpose. You don't want to make methane necessarily. You want them to make things that they can use as actual energy.
Yeah.
I guess the principles of controlling the populations of the gut fauna are the same. So you guys mentioned feeding them an additive from Bovar. If I'm pronouncing that right, it's a strange name.
Probably.
I think.
Bovar, who knows?
Yeah. Well, I work in communications as well, so you'd think I'd know about it.
We both failed.
Yeah. But they use a chemical that's very similar to an enzyme that's involved in combining the hydrogen with the carbon dioxide in that methogenesis series of reactions you were talking about. So that's like the final step in what produces the methane.
Yeah.
And from what I've read, there are several microorganisms in the cow's stomach that could use the enzyme. So giving them this additive that's chemically similar in shape to their enzyme blocks the enzyme itself from doing its job, which I thought was pretty neat.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing you can look into. But obviously, for anaerobic digestion purposes, you want the methane. Currently, anaerobic digestion's the main way you would make biogenic methane from organic matter, so like waste, sewage sludge.
You want to keep that bovare away from your anaerobic digester if you're a chemical engineer then.
Well, it wouldn't be ideal because we want the methane.
Exactly. So yeah, you're saying that methane is a useful gas.
Yeah.
If we can capture it in that well-controlled system that a chemical engineer would have.
Yeah, that's not necessarily the case for a cow.
No, but there's also more to this story for the cow because there are other gut fauna or microorganisms that can use the hydrogen to produce things like acetate or hydrogen sulfide or ammonium.
Yeah.
And those things, because they all use the hydrogen competing with the methanogenesis. Am I pronouncing that right? Methanogenesis. Am I putting an extra sound in there?
Methanogenesis.
That's all right.
Yeah.
So there are other organisms that can use the hydrogen. So instead of producing methane, these other microbes can kind of be like hydrogen sinks.
But the stuff that you've listed isn't really good for a cow because they're kind of corrosive.
Oh no. I'm guessing they're producing them in relatively small amounts so that the concentration would be low enough that they're not corroding their own stomachs and they'll excrete them eventually. So they might have like eggy smelling gases coming out of them.
That's hydrogen sulfide.
Yeah. Humans do it too, I guess.
They do.
So I read some research that said simply suppressing methane production might not be great because the hydrogen could inhibit these beneficial microbial processes that make conversion of food to energy less efficient. That sounds like a really big mouthful there. Did that make sense?
It made sense to me.
So basically what I'm saying is just having hydrogen that's sitting in the cow's stomach or potentially being used by some other processes isn't necessarily enough unless you can also make the cow microbe system use the food more efficiently.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are those different metabolic pathways that I mentioned, different things that the cow's gut fauna do. So one pathway they can make use of is to make propionate, which consumes the hydrogen and produces molecules which can be used as an energy source by the cow.
So like glucose or fatty acids.
I presume so, yeah. So I feel like just saying stop producing methane isn't quite correct. It's making the cow's microbiome work more efficiently to make the cow make better use of its food.
But you also want it to do in a way that doesn't actually harm the cows, but could also maybe potentially make them more productive, happier, because they have more efficient digestive systems, so they don't have to be as gassy.
Yeah, and maybe don't make too much acetate or hydrogen sulfide because that'd be bad for them.
That'd be bad. Be really bad. They want more glucose and fatty acids and potentially amino acids.
Kind of suggesting that there's a lot more research to do to figure out how to really optimize what's going on in the cow's stomach. And I was reading about some cows that were fed the Bovar additive, which has got quite a long name, shortened to 3-NOP, if you like.
There's a long name.
Yeah, 3-nitrooxypropanol, I think that is.
Yep.
3-nop will do.
Yep.
So they were feeding them the Bovar additive, 3-nop, as well as a chemical called fumarate, which I assume is pronounced correctly there. I could be doing it wrong.
Probably.
Again.
I just read the names. I don't actually talk to anyone who uses them, so your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, same. I've done all this reading online and I've not spoken to anyone about this, so I don't know if I'm doing this correctly.
Yeah.
So the cow's own microbiome can produce this fumarate. And the experimenters found that when they gave the cows fumarate, as long as the 3-nop or the Bovar, less methane was produced overall.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, and it shifted the cow's microbiome to use hydrogen to make these volatile fatty acids that you mentioned instead of the methane. So it was much better to do that than just to feed them the 3-nop on its own.
That is cool.
Yeah.
So I guess from like a chemical engineering perspective, so like technically chemical engineers, we do more of scaling up industrial processes from lab or bench scale to massive industrial scale. But like a small subset of chemical engineering is around engineering reactions. So I guess this could like fit into like how to enhance a bacterial population within like a certain biome if you did want to shift a reaction in favour of producing certain favourable products rather than stuff that's unfavourable.
Yeah, I'd also read that some researchers are looking at feeding cows probiotics or, good gut bacteria to shift them away from making methane and using their food more efficiently. But it sounds like it's really difficult because the bacteria don't tend to survive outside of the cow's stomach where there's oxygen present. So I guess getting it into your lab bench bioreactor might present a challenge if you wanted to do an experiment on it.
Yeah, I guess that's also true for humans because I think the medical advice is like probiotics, prebiotics, they don't really work because there's not much proof to show that the bacteria actually survives once it's been digested and makes it through to the actual parts of your guts that have the bacteria.
I can see how that would make sense. If it survives only in your gut, it might not get through your stomach acid. I didn't really consider that though when I've looked at the food that I eat. It's worth knowing. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe some bacteria survives, but who knows?
Yeah. I was also reading about something that I thought, well, this is chemical engineering. There are some researchers who are developing sensors to monitor concentrations of things like volatile fatty acids and propionate and other things inside the cow to tell the farmers how to feed them.
Ooh.
Yes, they're trying to get them closer to shifting them towards having a really efficient digestive system and minimal methane production with these sensors built into the cow. That it sounds like it's a little pill that they eat, and it's like wirelessly transmitting data outside of the cow.
Yeah, that is really interesting. It's also an interesting analogy. So in which case, should we be moving more towards a selective breeding?
So my first thought was, when I heard you talking about this in the previous episode, how on earth do you select a cow to have good gut microbes? I mean, there's so much variability going on there. It's not just about the individual itself. It's about the entire system, host-microbe interaction. And I came across this great study from some Scottish researchers where they were looking at the metagenome of these cows to figure out what their gut microbes are doing, basically. So they essentially take a sample of the rumen contents from the cow, analyse all the genes in there to see what the microorganisms are doing, which genes they're expressing, and this effectively tells them what they're up to.
Okay, but how does this relate to selective breeding of cows? What about the actual genetic makeup of the cow itself rather than what's just in its rumen?
This is what I thought as well. It confused me a little bit because they did specifically talk about genetic traits of the cow, but then never looked at the cow's genetics. What they were doing was looking for any hereditable influence of the host on this microbial community that could affect methane production, ultimately looking to improve the efficiency of the microbes to convert food into useful things and not methane. But it was a really controlled experiment. This is what so impressed me about this. They were taking some cows doing natural cowy things and then controlling as many variables as possible to come out with this really detailed study of what was going on in their guts and figuring out which adult cow might have an effect and how.
As a engineer, I do like controlled experiments. I like it when everything is accounted for and you have less uncertainty. But as a human and as a vegetarian, although not an ethical vegetarian, I would hope that the animals were treated well in these controlled experiments.
Yeah, I mean, any researcher working with animals has to go through the ethics process and get approval, don't they? And these cows sounded like they were treated so well. There's like palatial conditions. They had all these immunizations. They were really disease-free. They seemed to have all the food they could eat. They were grass-fed outside for a while before coming inside for controlled conditions. It sounds like they were treated just amazingly well until the end of the experiment.
Okay, so in terms of like controlling these experiments, like how do they actually control all of the variables? Because cows do what they want to do.
Yes. So to look at these hereditable factors that may affect what's going on in the cow's stomach, they selected some purebred male cows, Aberdeen Angus, and some, I think they're pronounced Limousin cows.
Like limousine, but slightly different.
I guess. Yeah, with no E.
Yeah.
And then they had a range of females who were artificially inseminated from these male cows. And they made sure they weren't using twin offspring so that each animal ended up with its own specific maternal effect that would influence the microbiota. So the maternal effect isn't controlled, but the male effect or the paternal effect is controlled. And they ended up with 36 calves from each male cow breed. So a reasonable sample size of 72.
That's a lot of babies.
Yeah, a lot of space, isn't it, for cows to get big and be happy?
Yeah.
So they took about 5 weeks to adapt these cows to their experimental diets. They had 2 different diets as well. They were either one that was predominantly high forage or natural grassy stuff, I guess, and one that was predominantly high concentrate or the artificial feed that they might get. They were given time to get used to the pens they were living in and the electronic feeders that would measure their food consumption. So how much food the cows ate every day was measured and how much weight gain they had was recorded as well. So 56 days, so quite a long experiment.
I mean...
Is it not? A chemical engineer is a longer experiment, you're going to tell me?
I mean, I think 56 days is pretty decent. Because it also sounds quite expensive. Because you've got a lot of cows. You need a lot of space. And that's a fairly decent size for, like, just taking samples.
Yeah, I'm guessing it kept the researchers quite busy.
Yeah. I'm assuming what they were most interested in was methane, but also stuff related to the cow's digestive system. You can kind of test their poo, but you get more information once the cow's dead and you can investigate their guts.
They did put the cows in the gas analysis chambers that you guys mentioned in the episode.
Yeah, they're weird.
Yeah, so they measured their methane production. They did also sample some of the room, and this amazes me. They basically took samples of the cows' insides.
While they were alive?
Some while they were alive, and then some after they were slaughtered, I think. But then they did this like massive data analysis of all of this genetic data from the gut bacteria or the gut organisms to figure out what was having an effect on methane emissions and what was having an effect on converting food into useful products by sort of correlating that with the diet they had or their breed type, and kind of ruled out all these different factors and figured out what was making an effect on what.
So in terms of like what dietary factors are important for cows, in specifically around microbiomes and influencing methane production, what did they find?
They noticed quite quickly, I thought this was quite interesting, although it's a side point to the research, but they noticed that Aberdeen Angus calves tended to have higher methane emissions, but then they also noticed those cows ate more food. So when they accounted for that, it was the same as the Limousin cows.
Okay.
I guess that just suggests those cows grow more quickly. They've done some previous work, it sounded like, that they were sort of building on in this study to look at the differences in the bacteria that produce the methane and other bacteria, and looked at the ratio of those two species or populations to see if there was a difference between the two different types of adult male cow that had given rise to these calves. I feel like I'm talking in a really roundabout way here, and I don't know why. So they found previously that they can use this ratio of methanogenic bacteria to other bacteria to predict methane emissions that seems to correlate reasonably well with the type of animal it's come from.
Okay. Because they proved to know that. Is that something that they used to choose the cows? Because they only used Angus and the, not limousine, but limousine minus an E type of cow.
I assume they did, although they didn't seem to outright say that in the research. But they were definitely looking at cows that produce a lot of methane versus cows that didn't produce a lot of methane within the different populations they were looking at, and looking at differences there.
Was there something useful from the experiments that scientists now can use, or do we need to do more research?
I got the impression that they need to do more research because they found this trend in predicting what a cow produces based on that ratio of different gut populations.
Yeah.
And one of the questions they were trying to answer in the research was obviously what can be inherited from one adult to the offspring. So effectively, how does the host genetics control the microbiome? And they didn't exactly answer that question. They did say there's not a lot of evidence out there for hereditable traits that relate to this. But they did do a little bit of a literature review and said that things like pH of the rumen, which is controlled by their saliva, can affect things like short-chain fatty acid absorption and how long it takes for certain products to pass out of the rumen, which can affect efficiency. And they also said that the variation in the physical structure and size of the rumen, as well as the intensity of contractions and passage rate of digestate, all could have an influence on rumen microbial community and how many of each kind of microbe there are. And all of those traits, they say, are hereditable. So I would imagine they then start trying to look at the genes that affect those different traits of the cow and see what's going on there. But I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking about this in too much detail, and they need to take more of an engineering approach and just look at the cow.
How does the saliva affect the pH of the rumen? Does that also happen in other animals, or is it just animals with a rumen?
They didn't specifically say. They mentioned that the saliva contains bicarbonates.
Okay.
And that was mainly it, and it controls the pH between about 6 and 7. Whether that's the same in humans, not a clue. Or sheep that have rumen, or other animals that don't have rumens. I don't know. Something to look into for a future episode, maybe.
Yeah. We could just do an episode on how to have healthier guts.
I guess we could. Apparently it's not eating probiotics, though.
No, I think that's a good place to leave it. I think we're kind of going off topic now.
I agree.
Unsurprisingly, looking at what happens inside a cow's digestive system is amazingly complicated, and it sounds like more work is going on in terms of how to optimize cow feed while also selectively breeding cows. The sort of detailed work is really needed to help reduce methane emissions to help address the climate emergency.
Yep, sounds like a fair summary of what we're saying in this episode and the original one you guys did.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.